My name is Steve Posiask. I'm president of the American Consumer Institute. We're a 501c3 educational research organization with a focus on consumer policies. And today, I think we have a real good consumer policy, and we're going to hear some different perspectives on an issue following biosimilar competition and some of the barriers to entry that are currently faced in the market. So with that, let me begin. I'll be your moderator today. We have a wonderful panel of experts here today. But just as an introduction, the FDA has begun, when they began approving generic competition some 30 years ago, we look at it today and we see prices are running approximately 75% lower than their brand name products, and consumers saving approximately $1 trillion over the last decade. So clearly, generic competition was a success. So after the patent lives were exhausted, allowing entry and competition to drive down and discipline the market in a fashion provided consumers with wonderful opportunities to save money and to get quality outcomes in terms of patient care. But like those savings, generic drugs, there's another opportunity, I think, today in terms of increasing competition and dramatically reducing pharmaceutical drug costs. This time, it involves a very expensive, innovative class of drugs called biologics, today's topic, and the potential to introduce their generic-like counterpart, biosimilars. Despite the promise of patient benefits, the FDA has not approved a single biosimilar drug like other countries around the world have done since 2006. So biologics, just as background, again, they're large molecule drugs produced in living systems such as plant cells and microorganisms. These biologic drugs are often used to treat some of the most serious life-threatening diseases. However, the manufacturing of these products are much more complex than conventional costs, and as a result, research costs and development can run into the billions of dollars. This means that patient costs can be extremely expensive, and we'll hear some examples of that today. But for example, there is one drug that's being sold for $400,000 per patient per year. The high cost of pharmaceuticals, especially biologics, has become an important issue in the battle in terms of reducing healthcare costs in this country. The European Union, Canada, Australia, and other countries have already approved the manufacturing and dispensing of biosimilar drugs, and the United States yet has no pathway or mechanism to encourage that entry. As such, the benefits of lower prices, such as we have in generic drugs today, is not happening. And just a few years ago, the FDA was given a mechanism through the new healthcare law to go ahead and to move towards developing that pathway, but yet we're seeing a lot of delays in developing it. So unlike the chemical drugs that face competition from generic drugs, producing identical biologics is extremely difficult and may actually be possible. Biosimilars must be bioequivalent or comparable to original drugs, and if in fact we're going to make sure that these are safe and effective for consumers. So we're going to talk about a lot of issues today, and some about the need to be cautious, but on the other side, where some manufacturers are arguing that there needs to be a creation of a new naming system called an International Non-Proprietary Names, INN, which some of the panelists will refer to, that many suggest that will increase transparency, and then others suggest, no, that's going to create some confusion and dangerous medication errors. So that brings us to the topic today, and the need to get a pathway to heighten competition and lower prices for consumers and bring those benefits, better patient outcomes, choice, and save consumers money. I mean, consumers really deserve better. So today's panelists, first we're going to hear from Lee Purvis immediately here on my left with the AARP. She's going to give us a consumer perspective on the issue. And then we're going to move over to Andrew McColhey. He's with the RAND Corporation, and he's going to talk about some empirical evidence and cost-benefit savings, who benefits from this. And then next we're going to move to Jillian Schulte, and she's with the American Pharmacists Association, and she's going to address these issues as well as remark on naming and other safety issues. And then I'm going to wrap up Christine Simmons. So Christine is with the Generic Pharmaceutical Association, and she's going to move on and talk a little bit about the need for removing roadblocks and getting competitive benefits to consumers. So if you haven't had it, when you leave, please grab the bios in the back. I'm not going to spend time going through that. And so with that, let's begin with Lee.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here today. My name is Lee Purvis, and I'm with AARP's Public Policy Institute. For those of you who don't know us, we kind of operate as AARP's internal think tank. We develop and help guide policy and advocacy on pretty much everything AARP works on, and my particular piece of the pie is prescription drug issues. I'm going to start off with just kind of giving you a little bit of background on why biologics and biosimilars matter to AARP. I'm also going to touch on a couple of the issues that are still ongoing and still being debated in the public domain that are concerns for us, and then give a really brief introduction on how we think things are going to look if biosimilars don't really work out for us. So first and foremost, I think it's really important to note that biologics really are where the drug industry is heading. There are a massive number of them in development. A lot of our spending is expected to be on biologics in the very near future. And it's also important to note, as Steve mentioned, until recently, there was no way for generic versions of biologic drugs to come onto the market. On the other hand, a lot of them are coming off patent. So obviously that added a little bit of urgency in terms of getting a generic process in place. Something else that's really worth mentioning is that a biologic might come on the market with one indication. However, a lot of manufacturers are really expanding the number of indications. So now we're seeing drugs that are being used for a much larger population. Some of them have anywhere from 10 to 15 indications. And if you look at their financial documents, they're working on expanding it even further. So these drugs are being used by more and more people. Also, as Steve mentioned, the treatment costs associated with biologics are extremely high. The annual cost can go anywhere from $25,000 to $400,000 or more. Something else, as I mentioned previously, the patient population sizes are growing. For example, there's a new cholesterol drug. It's biologic. It's going to be coming on the market towards the end of next year. It's indicated for what they think now more than 10 million people. The estimated cost is $10,000 a year, and it's a cholesterol drug, so it's used chronically. So you're looking at those costs ongoing. And as some of my other work has indicated, prescription drug prices don't tend to stagnate, they increase. So the price that you're looking at right now is not the one you'll be paying 10 years from now. One of the reasons that AARP is really interested in prescription drug issues in general is because older adults use a lot of prescription drugs. More than 2/3 of them are taking 2 or more drugs at any given moment. And they also are taking them for chronic conditions. Older adults have a lot of chronic conditions. More than 2/3 have 2 or more. So when we're talking about people who are taking prescription drugs, we're talking about people who are taking them for the rest of their lives. This is not a temporary issue for them. This is every day, every year, for as long as they're alive. Another thing worth mentioning is that biologics are typically used to treat conditions that primarily affect older adults. So cancer or multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis. So when we talk about people using biologics, we are typically talking about people that are in the older segments of the population. And something else I feel like is worth mentioning, because a lot of times this is kind of misinterpreted in the media. Medicare beneficiaries are not wealthy. So when we talk about these costs, we're not talking about people who can absorb them easily. The median income is just over $20,000, and more than 1 in 4 have less than $10,000 in savings. So if you're prescribed a drug that costs tens of thousands of dollars, obviously that's not really going to be something that's financially feasible. A lot of people also think that Medicare is kind of a saving grace. Unfortunately, there is a lot of cost sharing associated with Medicare that a lot of people don't understand. Under Medicare Part B, which covers physician services, patients are responsible for 20% of their costs. There is no out-of-pocket cap. So if you're prescribed a $10,000 drug, you are looking at 20% of those costs. Obviously, that is a massive amount of money. Under Part D, which covers outpatient prescription drugs. First of all, Part D plans are typically now using coinsurance, which is where you're responsible for a percentage of the cost as opposed to a flat copay, which is what most of us are used to seeing. In some instances, the coinsurance can get as high as 60%. Again, that's a lot of money. And yes, there is an out-of-pocket under Part D, unlike under Part B. There is a catastrophic cap. However, even after you reach catastrophic coverage, if you have an expensive drug, you still have a fair amount of cost sharing. For example, Humira, which is a very common biologic, you've probably seen the commercials, that's still anywhere between $100 and $150 a month in catastrophic coverage. Something I always like to point out when people just say, oh, well, that's Medicare's problem. Well, Medicare is in some ways kind of a trendsetter. Medicare goes and private insurance tends to follow. So we're seeing a lot more private coverage that's going towards specialty tiers, which is when there's a fourth tier that's usually associated with coinsurance. They're also moving towards coinsurance more generally. Under exchange plans, there is extremely high cost sharing for specialty drugs. That's anywhere 40 to 60%. Again, that's a lot of money for really anyone, much less, obviously, Medicare beneficiaries are our concern, but we also pay attention to the 50-plus population generally, and that's a lot of money really for anyone. Something else that's worth mentioning is, as we talk about this cost sharing and how high it is, in the meantime, PBMs are saying that the quote-unquote relatively low cost sharing for these drugs actually is too small. It doesn't represent enough of the cost. So we're going to start seeing it spread around in the cost sharing elsewhere in the plans. So you'll see your coinsurance, your cost sharing go up for drugs that aren't these drugs, or your premiums going up, or your deductibles going up. So even if you aren't taking these drugs, you will be feeling the impact of them. Something else that I always feel like I need to point out. Usually when you start talking about high cost of prescription drugs, someone brings up a patient assistance programs. I don't want to say they are bad things. I think they are great for the people that they can help. However, they can be less than generous. Sometimes they have very low income thresholds. They require you to be uninsured. Some might require you to spend a certain amount of your income before you can participate. And there's also, even within each individual manufacturer, there is a different patient assistance program for each drug. So someone who's taking 2 of these might have to navigate 2 separate programs with 2 separate income thresholds and 2 separate eligibility processes. So it's not an easy thing to use, so it's not really a cure-all. Okay, so I'm going to touch really briefly on 2 issues that are an ongoing concern for us that I think we'll be discussing more today. One is state legislation that we have been seeing popping up pretty much everywhere. For those of you who don't know, there are efforts at the state level to create and implement and pass new legislation that would basically affect the substitution of biosimilar drugs for biologic drugs. Our stance is we're not quite sure why it's needed at this exact moment, given that there are no biosimilars on the market. Our overriding statement on this is that if we can trust the FDA to regulate a biologic, we can certainly trust them to regulate a biosimilar, and it's really unclear to us why states think that there are additional protections that are needed. Just in a general sense, our feeling is that if the FDA has deemed that a biosimilar is interchangeable with a biologic, the substitution process should be the same as it is for traditional drugs. It's very simple. If FDA can regulate a biologic, they can regulate a biosimilar, and that's pretty much where we come down on it. Our concern with the state legislation is that it's enacting barriers that I'm sure other people will touch on in this panel that are going to effectively reduce substitution and increase healthcare costs. And again, this isn't just something that touches consumers. You're talking about programs and insurance and coverage and that will all be impacted by this. Again, you will see premiums go up, cost sharing go up. Taxpayers will be paying more for public programs. So this is something that impacts everyone. Something else that's been briefly discussed is naming. We think that having different INNs is a real problem from a safety perspective. Expecting a prescriber to remember the names of the thousands of drugs that are on the market is just not feasible. We think that also it's going to be separating the safety information that's associated with the brand name biologic if you have a different name for the biosimilars. So again, this is a safety issue for us. We don't want to, we also think it might create the impression that these are different products that have different issues. They don't. So we want to make sure that these interchangeable products are treated that way. And then again, it comes back to having different INNs really disrupts substitution, which increase healthcare costs, which impacts everyone. So as far as where we think things are going in the future, quite frankly, given the costs associated with these products, this really is something that has to work, and it has to work well. There need to be biosimilars on the market. They need to be used as effectively as possible. Otherwise, what we have at this exact moment is not sustainable for anyone. We cannot keep absorbing the costs associated with these products without some level of competition. There's also the very real fact that patients cannot afford the costs associated with these products. So we need something that is less expensive, equally effective, but less expensive on the market for them to use, because otherwise you're going to have patients who aren't treating conditions, which of course leads to more expensive healthcare costs down the road. And then my final thought is always that Medicare advances are meaningless unless people can afford to use them. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. That was excellent. Andrew, he's with the RAND Corporation. Let me see if I can get this set up for you. Where are we? Okay. Here we go.
Great. Thanks, Steve. My name's Andrew Mulcahy. I'm an associate policy researcher with the RAND Corporation just across the river in Arlington. For those of you who don't know, RAND, just wanted to mention that we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit institution that helps improve policy and decision-making through research and analysis. The work I'll talk about today was done under the auspices of RAND Health, which is a part of RAND. It's one of the, if not the largest private health policy research shop in the world, with over about 300 research staff, many of which have doctoral or terminal degrees, with over 300 ongoing projects at any one point in time and over 300 publications each year. So my goal today is to talk about one of those publications, a recent study by RAND on the potential cost savings from biosimilars. So in our study, we did a few things. We developed a conceptual framework to organize the drivers of biosimilar cost saving. We reviewed a whole set of existing estimates on the potential cost savings from biosimilars. We came up with a new estimate of cost savings from biosimilars using some inputs from the literature and also some very current sales data on biologics. We also discussed policy issues and implications from biosimilars around cost savings. So before I get more into the study, I just want to note that the research was funded by Sandoz, which is a division of Novartis. RAND isn't affiliated with either of those companies or any other group present here on the panel. I just wanted to say, too, that the views that I'm going to express now in the report aren't necessarily the views of Sandoz and Novartis. The study was both internally and externally peer-reviewed, and it's publicly available on the RAND website, and I'll show you where and how to get it at the end of my comments today. So I thought I'd talk through a few caveats and limitations now so we can end the comments on more of a positive note. So first, I just wanted to mention a point. I think it's already come up in some contexts that despite some similarities, biosimilars are not the same thing as small molecule generic drugs. From a scientific perspective, from a regulatory perspective, and almost certainly from a competition perspective. I think sometimes it's hard to find pieces in the popular media that don't mention that link to small molecule generics, because there are some important similarities. But there's a real risk of reading too much into that analogy. So we tried we were very diligent in our study to make those links where we thought they were appropriate and avoid them where we thought they weren't. I guess on a second point, there's still a lot of unknowns in biosimilars from a regulatory perspective, from a litigation perspective, and from a market perspective. These are very new, and the landscape is evolving quickly, and it will evolve over time. And this is actually one place where I think it's really safe to make a link to small molecule generics. You know, the amazing evolution of strategies and markets that we've seen in small molecule generics over the past 30 years. I think we should expect to see the same thing in biosimilars too. And so we'll start with the first few biosimilars going through regulatory approval now. We'll start to learn what this market's going to look like, but it will change over time. And so it's important to keep estimates like the ones I'll talk about today updated over time too, as we know more. And finally, just wanted to highlight that a focus on our study is cost savings from lower prices. And as an economist, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about some other effects that we should expect when we see lower prices. So the common The common wisdom is that when prices are lower, utilization will increase. And so that triggers a whole other set of really important outcomes that could come from biosimilars. I mean, more initiation on biologic treatment, better adherence on biologic treatment. We didn't focus on any of those impacts in our study, but I think it's something we discuss, and it's something that's definitely worth keeping an eye on. All of the cost savings we'll discuss today focus on savings from lower prices. So now I'll just run through 4 drivers of biosimilar cost saving that we identified in the study. The first is the safety and efficacy of the biosimilar, maybe compared to the reference product, but assuming similarity, it really is thinking about safety and efficacy of the biosimilar relative to other biologics in the same class, relative to other drugs or other treatments entirely, other kinds of treatment modalities entirely. The second is payment and the incentives that physicians and other providers face when they're considering whether or not they should use a biosimilar or an originator brand name biologic. Third is the acceptability of biosimilars by patients and by prescribers, and we're thinking here the perception of quality or safety or other important dimensions. And I think the last one here I've underlined and bolded because I think it's the most important, is competition. And this is, in our minds, what's really going to drive cost savings. I think you can make an argument that each of those other drivers ultimately gets you down into competition. And it really does come down to the number of firms in the market, when they enter, and how all of these market dynamics play out. So there are a lot of kind of old at this point, but some of them are very good, estimates of the potential savings from biosimilars. If you look down the left-hand column here and you look at publication dates, a lot of these are vintage 2007, 2008. That's part of the motivation for RAND to take another look at this question. So we reviewed a whole set of these listed on this table and other studies to pick out, to help us understand the range of reasonable estimates for price differentials between biosimilars and their reference biologics, and other factors too, like biosimilar market penetration. Some of these studies focus on the US experience from a kind of a forward-looking point of view. Some of them look at the experience in the EU, where biosimilars have been on the market for some years now. Others look at the experience in a small set of biologics in the US, where for various reasons there are already kind of, in a sense, biosimilar drugs, multiple different versions of the same or similar biologic. So we used estimates from the studies in the last slide and from the literature, and we paired it with some very recent sales data for the top 100 biologics in the US to come up with a new updated estimate of the potential cost savings from biosimilars. So our main estimate is the punchline here at the top of the slide, and that's biosimilars under the set of assumptions I'll talk about in a minute, will lead to a potential $44 billion savings over a 10-year period from 2014 through 2024. And when we thought about this, these are a set of assumptions that you need to make to come up with an estimate like this, because it hasn't happened yet. And so we've kind of varied some of those assumptions and come up with a range that we think is reasonable, between $33 and $66 billion over 10 years. And I've listed those key assumptions here at the bottom of the slide. So we have we assumed a 10% annual year-on-year growth in biologic sales, up to 20% exposure of those biologic sales to biosimilar competition by year 10, a 60% biosimilar market share when biosimilars do enter a market, a 35% price discount relative to the originator's price. And then we also treated some of those markets where there are multiple versions of biologics, like insulin's a good example. We treated them differently from other biologics, where it's more of a single manufacturer right now. So this pie chart breaks down that $44.2 billion over different therapeutic classes. I think it's important to note, and this is probably no surprise, that over half of this, or about half of the savings, come from just 3 classes. So anti-tumor necrosis factor alpha drugs for rheumatoid arthritis, long-acting insulins for diabetes, and monoclonal antibodies used in cancer treatment. And so that's really where a lot of the current sales are, and that's where a lot of the savings are. Some of these smaller pie pieces up in the upper left there are relatively small in terms of sales right now, but they're also growing quickly. I think the next question we turn to is who will benefit from these savings? And in the short term, I think we're thinking about how insurers pay for drugs and in some cases purchase drugs through or negotiate prices. And so I think in the short term, those insurers and payers will realize some of the savings. But in the longer term, as insurers pass those savings on to employers and to patients, and as public health systems pass on savings to taxpayers, that's really where we see the savings accruing at the end of the day. So taxpayers and basically anyone who is buying health insurance would benefit from this. But I think it is really important, and we already touched on that in the first presentation, to talk about the impact on patients who are currently taking biologics. There's an immediate benefit for patients who are currently taking biologics, and I think the link between biosimilars and savings through cost sharing is important to think about. And in the report, we have this table that helps kind of put some dollar figures on what savings to a patient taking a biologic today, what savings they might realize if and when biosimilars enter the market. So there are a few assumptions underlying this table. The first is we're assuming a patient takes one prescription and it's a $40,000 a year biologic. We're also assuming that there's no out-of-pocket cap or other limit on their cost sharing here. And so with those two assumptions, we've plotted the savings for a few different coinsurance rates, which can range from 10 to 40, 50, 60%, and then different price reductions for a biosimilar relative to originator. And you can see even at pretty modest price decreases off the originator, we're talking a lot of money in savings to patients. And if you get into the 35% price reduction, which is an assumption we think is defensible, you get into several $1,000s. And so I'll wrap up here. Just thank everyone for the opportunity to talk about this study. The URL at the top of the screen is the link to the RAND report, which, as I mentioned, it's a pretty short read. It's a free read, and I encourage you all to download the PDF. I've also had luck getting here just Googling RAND and biosimilars. I think it takes you right here. And then thanks very much.
Thank you, Andrew. I love seeing the empirical evidence. I appreciate it. Okay, so now we'll hear from Joanne.
Morning or afternoon, actually, at this point. I'm Jillian Schulte. I'm the Director of Regulatory Affairs at the American Pharmacists Association. Unfortunately, I don't have slides. I'm not the greatest PowerPointer, and I drive people nuts by bouncing around, so we're just going to do it plain. But at the American Pharmacists Association, we are a nonprofit. We're a trade association. We represent all pharmacists across the nation in all practice settings. So your neighborhood pharmacist, your independent community pharmacist, also pharmacists in health systems and clinical researchers as well. So it's a very broad-based organization that way. One of the things that's kind of interesting for pharmacists with biosimilars is that we are not prescribers. That's one thing to know. We don't prescribe the drugs. We are the gatekeepers for drugs. So your clinicians will prescribe, and then we're the clinician at the door that says, okay, here's your script. So we have kind of a different set of concerns around biosimilars. Our main three concerns right now around biologics and biosimilars are patient safety, patient access, and then finally workflow integration. So from the patient safety perspective, we are of the opinion that the FDA should make all of the rules surrounding biosimilars and interchangeability. So as Lee mentioned, there have been a lot of state legislatures that have kind of taken this up as an issue in terms of how biosimilars should be substituted for biologics. And we think that that's very premature, given that there's no approved biosimilar yet on the United States market, even though there are two that are currently going through the process. And I know their FDA has said they've had something like 70 plus sponsor meetings on upcoming biologics and biosimilars. So we want to wait and see what FDA is going to say. They've always made the determinations about interchangeability. They did it for generics. They did it for small molecules. So we want to make sure that this is being done at that level and nothing's being litigated kind of outside of the regulatory sphere in the public space. For the patient access issue, this is kind of a consideration of cost and also how patients really get their biosimilars. So a lot of biologics are drugs that are not going to be, you're not going to pick them up at your local pharmacy. Many of them are being given in the hospital and in health systems only right now. And that's not all of them, but that's quite a few. So as that changes, as more drugs come onto the market, as this becomes a bigger cost and also a bigger piece of just the general drug landscape, it'll be interesting to see how patients access those drugs. But from the cost perspective, we are very supportive, APHA being we, have always been very supportive of anything that's going to be safe for patients, cost effective. And our understanding currently is that biosimilars are going to be safe. FDA will regulate them the same way they regulate all drugs. My understanding from the European market so far is that they have not had major adverse events or really anything different from the safety profile on general biologics for these drugs. So kind of having this larger discussion in the public forum about, well, let's change substitution laws now before there's something on the market, or let's look at whether things need to be named differently. It suggests that these products are different, and in consumers' minds, once that's there, it's very hard to re-educate them. This happened, I think, to some degree with generics when they came onto the market. And so pharmacists is kind of the frontline clinicians for drugs. They're the ones who are going to be up talking to a patient about, well, this is actually the same drug. And there's still quite a bit of, even with generics, people will say, well, no, I don't want acetaminophen, I want Tylenol. Tylenol is what works. It's the same drug. So biosimilars are different, as Andrew pointed out. They're not going to be exactly the same as a generic or a small molecule. They're more complex. But that's the way the whole system is moving towards pharmacogenomics and personalized medicine. And as that happens, we have to kind of adapt to the idea that there are always going to be risks associated with products, but they have to be written and they have to be couched in a way that allows for patients to still access them appropriately. Because if patients think their drugs are not safe and something's substituted, they're not going to take it, and then you end up with an adherence problem, which will also drive up costs and really affect patient quality and outcomes. And so finally, the other issue we have with biologics right now, and this is particular to the naming really, is workflow integration. So pharmacists work on computer systems. I mean, everybody has an EHR, an electronic health record. The problem with it is that the electronic health records and the pharmacy systems, they're not the same ones in a lot of cases that are used in the health systems and the hospitals. It's just the whole EHI or HIT kind of integration piece is not quite there yet. So at present, you drop the name in, and a pharmacist has to actually either manually enter it or look it up. And if they're having to manually enter an individual non-proprietary name for every drug, so that's a brand name, they're assuming that the physician got that name right when they wrote it. They're assuming that they will then have to look at substitution. So what happens in a lot of cases is you're going to have mistakes, and then the pharmacist will be calling the physician to check their work. And this is common practice to make sure that the prescription's valid, but it also slows down patients getting their drugs. And it can be frustrating for both pharmacists and physicians because there's sort of a suggestion that they're checking their work, which, it's always good to have checks and balances, but nobody likes to be second-guessed. So there's that piece of it, too. So our view is that the naming structures for biosimilars and biologics should really mirror what's in place now for small molecule and generic drugs. And that's kind of what FDA has moved toward. So we don't have a decision yet on biologic naming, but they did announce that they're going to be doing a purple book. And what the purple book is it will list out the biologics, and then once they deem biosimilars interchangeable, it will list the interchangeable biosimilars. And there's something in place now that pharmacists use every day called the Orange Book, and that's for generics. And so they're very used to this system. This is how it works in practice. This is how it's always worked in practice. So they're very comfortable with having it work that way as well for biosimilars. And again, this all has to depend on what FDA determines about biosimilarity. And we're still a little ways away from that. There's a meeting coming up for the FDA on the first biosimilar, filgrastim, and that's January 7th. But our understanding is things are proceeding apace, and this will be something that's litigated in the FDA fairly soon. So generally speaking, the major pharmacy organizations, and I feel comfortable speaking for the National Community Pharmacists Association and also the National Association of Chain Drugstores on this, because we've submitted joint comments about naming in the past, is the idea that we would have we wouldn't have unique names. We would just have the individual non-proprietary name. So everybody is going to have that. You're going to have that core, like acetaminophen, but for a biosimilar and a biologic. And then if there are brand names on top of that, that's fine, but that's not how they're going to be prescribed. So it's going to be much easier for people to get access to the lower cost drug once it's on the market. And in some cases, for substitution policies now for regular drugs, and some states allow substitution just on the basis of the Orange Book automatically. And we're kind of hoping to get to that point if the FDA deems things interchangeable, because when you have situations where you have to notify a patient, notify a clinician, notify it within a certain time frame, again, that's that can create serious access concerns. And it also creates adherence concerns. When patients can't get their drugs right away, they get frustrated and fussy. And so it's always best to make sure that they can get what they need right away for medical reasons and also just for reasons of general ease of use. And then the other thing that we are a little concerned about with the naming, one of the arguments that has been made by some of the pharmaceutical companies and other stakeholders around naming is that biosimilars should have a different name because they need additional information for adverse drug event tracking. While we absolutely support tracking adverse drug events, there's a new law that was in place that was passed last year, the Drug Quality and Security Act. It had very specific track and trace provisions within it, Drug Supply Chain Security Act. And we think that having a separate ADE tracking system may not provide any additional information that's helpful. So, and it also kind of suggests, especially to the general public who can be sometimes a little skeptical of pharmaceutical companies in general, that there's something different about biosimilars, that they are more dangerous and thus need a different tracking system and a different safety system. And we don't want to have that become the norm, because as I said, once that gets into a consumer or patient's mind, it is very hard to re-educate, and the pharmacist is the one that's going to be doing it. And while our members are very happy to have those conversations with patients, it can be very difficult to get them to trust what you're saying, that when you say that this drug that you're giving them is going to be safe and effective. And of course, we always want it to be safe and effective, because once it's not, then that relationship is destroyed. So just to kind of wrap up, we really at APHA advocate for a regulatory scheme for biosimilars that parallels the existing frameworks for generics and small molecule drugs. The major concerns are that the framework doesn't impede or unnecessarily hinder the uptake of biosimilars once they're on the market. So patients who come to a pharmacist often have questions about their health insurance, and Lee kind of touched on this, and Andrew did as well. For a lot of patients, they have questions about their insurance, like what's going to be covered if you substitute? What's going to be covered if I take this drug versus that drug? And so we're very concerned about the movement of some of the drugs into the specialty tiers, because instead of having a fixed co-payment for those drugs, you're then going to have a percentage payment. And as Lee pointed out, that can be a very large percentage of someone's income, honestly, for some of these drugs. And while there are caps with the ACA, they're still pretty high. I mean, it's $6,000 plus for an individual and $12,700 for a family of 4. And that's in addition to other medical costs that they may be incurring at the same time. So we want to make sure that people are not being forced into taking more expensive drugs when a less expensive, very effective drug is on the market that will work for them, because that will probably increase their adherence, and then you don't run into adverse events in other areas of their health care. So that's a patient safety issue. We want to make sure that the FDA is making all decisions about interchangeability and substitution, and that that's being done at a federal level so we don't end up with a patchwork of different rules for different states, which often happens, but we'd prefer to have kind of a baseline acceptance of biosimilars in the same way that we have for generics and also for small molecules. And then finally, we want to see that the existing systems, however the naming is done, whatever's determined, that they're going to work within the existing framework for the pharmacy systems and the EHRs, because pharmacists weren't part of, they're not Medicare. We're not Medicare providers. So we're not part of the EHIT incentives that were in ACA. So there's not been money to upgrade all those systems in the same way some of the other clinicians have been able to do. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That was a really interesting perspective. Okay, so we're going to finish up here before Q&A with Christine from the Generic Pharmaceutical Association. Get this up for you.
Great.
There you go.
Great. Thanks, everyone, and hope you're enjoying your lunch. One of the great things about going last is that most everything has already been said by my colleagues here on the panel, and they've done a fantastic job in sort of laying out for you all sort of the promise of biosimilars, interchangeable biosimilars, and the potential barriers to achieving that promise for patients, for payers, for the healthcare system as a whole. So I'm just going to, I have about 1 billion slides, so we're going to skip most of those. I'm going to fill in a couple of holes, that we weren't able to cover thus far, and then we'll get to Q&A because I know that's what you're mainly waiting for. So GPHA, just to give our little brief overview, the Generic Pharmaceutical Association is the trade association representing the manufacturers of generic drugs and also biosimilars. As has been reported in the press, we are actually sort of launching a biosimilars division because we absolutely want to capture that space. There isn't exactly a straightforward trade association devoted solely to biosimilars and interchangeable biologics at this point. So that is something that we have been working on, obviously, with our members for years and years, and so we're going to formalize that somewhat going forward. So you've already heard much of this. I want to talk a little bit about something that Jillian touched on. So we know the FDA, we know that the United States, I should say, is lagging terribly far behind Europe and the rest of the world when it comes to making biosimilars and interchangeable biosimilars available to patients, which is a shame. And the FDA, however, is working toward enacting or implementing, I should say, the provisions of the Affordable Care Act that create the pathway. So they are on their way to doing that. And as of now, FDA has accepted 2 applications for biosimilars. Jillian mentioned Sandoz's filgrastim application, as well as this Celltrion application for a version of Remicade. So because right now there are really no hard and fast dates and rules around the issuance of the various, and there are multiple, guidance documents that would be necessary to fully implement the pathway. Those of you who are familiar with the FDA process know that the FDA can issue, like many agencies, a variety of types of regulatory documents, guidances, proposed rules, final rules. Sometimes rules are never even finalized. And so it's not clear, there's no real schedule per se to all of this. But what is driving the FDA at the moment is the fact that these applications are under consideration, and those applications do include some deadlines. So we should expect to see some guidance documents, nothing definite, coming out. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but just to sort of demonstrate that the process is moving. Jillian did mention that there is this public advisory committee meeting for the FDA's oncology or oncologic drug advisory committee that's coming up early in the new year. And that's a really great opportunity for those of you who are champions of biosimilars to voice your support in support of the application. There's an opportunity to speak in person at the meeting, and there's also an opportunity to submit written comments. So we are going to be working with the folks who have been strategic partners for our industry around this issue to make sure that we have a strong presence at the meeting because this is something that we definitely want to make sure that the FDA understands is critically important. I'm sure you can't read all of those, but there are a variety of guidance documents still outstanding. Guidance documents around exclusivity, guidance documents around the pharmacology data that's needed to sort of demonstrate the biosimilarity to a reference product, process documents about how the meetings will take place between the agency and the product sponsors, the scientific considerations, and the quality considerations. And these are all very, very important. Again, there's no hard and fast deadlines as to when we can expect them, but they are all critical to the implementation of the pathway. The Purple Book was mentioned. That was a big mark of progress for the FDA. So we'll see how that ultimately is used. It won't actually be purple, unlike the Orange Book, but it is a demonstration of progress on the part of the agency and something that folks were really hoping to see. So that's good news. We've talked a little bit about naming, actually quite a lot, so I don't think I need to spend too much time on here. And I apologize, this might be a little choppy, but this is the nature, I think, of batting cleanup after so many good presenters. But let me just go over a couple of things about the names. We touched a little bit on the idea of the safety aspect. And, we would just say that, in our view, that's really quite a red herring. It's completely not necessary to the safety profile of these products to have non-unique names. Unique names. We want them to have non-unique names. And so there already are several names and identifiers, which hopefully you can see on the screen, probably the most important of which is the NDC. And the National Drug Code is really sort of the driving factor for all of the track and trace issues that were referred to and that have been dealt with in legislation that was passed last year. So just to reiterate that this is, again, a type of red herring that is designed to really undermine public and prescriber patient confidence in biosimilars and interchangeable biologics, which is, of course, very similar, as someone mentioned, to the history in general of generic drug utilization and confidence for the public. That there are some innovator companies who consistently try to raise doubt about the safety and effectiveness profile of these products. And we've seen it dating back to 1984 when generics were first introduced to the market. We've overcome that dramatically. Generic drugs now make up 86% of all products dispensed. So that's huge. It went from 19% in 1984 to 86% today. And we hope to see great market penetration ultimately over time. It won't be probably as dramatic and as quick, relatively speaking, as it was for small molecule drugs. But we want to make sure that the practices and aspersions that were cast back in 1984 are not repeated today. And just to be a little bit more specific, to make sure that, in addition to the access and savings opportunities that we always discuss when we discuss these products, with respect to naming in particular, there are other items to consider. And there's the idea that it's a global market, and we want to be consistent in a global way around the naming. The savings we mentioned, but this is a new market for the United States, and it's forming, and there are a lot of factors that go into market formation. So we want to make sure that we're fostering an environment that will allow for that, with all of the attendant benefits, in terms of employment and so forth, that will come with the formation of the market. We definitely want to, also allow for the reimbursement that is critical to the adoption of the products. I think people often lose sight of the reimbursement aspect of market formation, but without reimbursement from federal programs, this would be, very difficult for biosimilars to really penetrate at the same utilization levels that generic small molecule drugs have. And biosimilars reimbursement is explicit in the Affordable Care Act, but it's unclear right now how CMS is going to truly implement that. So there's a lot of work to be done around that issue. So I think we've covered the main issues. I did just want to add in terms of the one last item on the naming, which speaks to the workflow issues that Jillian had raised. There is a group called NCPDP, which I'm not 100% sure what that stands for, but they are basically the coding geeks. They do all the coding. They are nonpartisan. They don't really have a dog in the fight. They just need to code. And they, on their own initiative, actually sent a letter and had a meeting with FDA several months back at sort of making sure that the FDA understood that if they adopt unique INNs, unique names, it's simply not going to work with the coding. And just from a very pragmatic, practical standpoint. And I would urge you all to take a look at that letter. We can certainly get it to you. I think we may have a link to it on our website, but you can also just Google NCPDP letter to agency or letter to FDA, and you'll find it. And it's pretty compelling. I mean, it's just very straightforward. And I think that's something to recognize as well, that the strong political element to these decisions, are unfortunately in some cases, I think, overriding the very practical issues that need to be addressed in order to make sure that these products can be available. So to that end, the trade association, as one would expect, has been doing a tremendous amount of advocacy and education effort on this. Education is really our number one priority in terms of making sure folks understand the promise of these products. We're going to be issuing within the next month or so a biosimilars handbook that's really designed to be a very straightforward educational piece explaining what biosimilars are and how they're manufactured and the promise that they hold. So that will be available on our website. In addition, we are very fortunate to have a strong network of allies because of the import of this issue to really everyone in the supply chain, as well as patient advocacy groups. And some of our allies are at the table, of course, but we mainly have payers, PBMs, retail pharmacies, labor unions, employee retirement systems, and some patient groups. And they've been very helpful in terms of amplifying our voice here on the Hill and with the administration and other forums. So we definitely urge those of you who represent folks who may be interested in participating in these efforts to reach out to us. It's a really good group, really highly engaged, and there's a lot of good opportunities coming up, particularly the meeting January 7th at FDA on the filgrastim application. So I think with that, I will sit down and we can take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. That was some really good presentations we just heard. One thing I just want to kind of raise right off the bat, kind of just to circle back to the whole safety issue one more time from the presentations. I'd like to ask a couple questions and see if we can get some interaction, and then I'd like to open it up to the floor. So let's start off. I mean, is there any legitimacy to the claims from biologic drug originators then that there should be concerns about the safety of biologics? I mean, we have the originators, for example, have been claiming that unique INNs are necessary for safety concerns. I mean, what's been the experience that we've seen in Europe, for example, in terms of safety and efficacy? Does Europe use INNs?
Sure. Make sure this is on. Yes. Okay. So the safety profile in Europe has been excellent. It's been really nearly perfect. We have some of our companies have done studies, and there are other studies out there to demonstrate that. So I think it's been 8 years now that interchangeable biologics have been available in Europe, and it's all going very, very smoothly. Obviously, it's an entirely different healthcare system there, but safety is safety, and there have not been any problems. So that's the most important point. And yes, they do use the INN. The INN is a global standard that's been in place for years and years and years. And in fact, were it to change, there would have to be a certain amount of retroactivity that would have to apply, which would also be another large burden to the system to absorb. So the INN is a universal international standard that is set, and then the United States adopts its own naming as well, but it's the same and consistent with the INN. So, so really, it's actually to change it to have non-unique names. That's the outlier position. The consistent position, consistent with the safety profile for all products, not just biosimilars, obviously, but small molecule drugs as well, has just a long, rock-solid history of safety.
I think it's also worth mentioning that FDA, in a lot of ways, already is regulating biosimilars, even though they're not on the market. The innovator biologics differ from batch to batch, and FDA is able to look at those and determine whether there's too much of a difference between batch to batch to require additional testing. So FDA has already demonstrated the fact that they're able to regulate biosimilars. So suddenly saying that they have lost that ability is a little bit disingenuous.
I would add too that for biosimilars, one of the things that we're hearing about the ADEs tracking the adverse drug events is that one of the suggestions has been to have either a prefix or a suffix attached to the individual non-proprietary name. We're a little confused, I think, as we being APHA, confused as to how that's going to be helpful given the Drug Quality and Security Act. So in the next 10 years, we'll be able to track down to the unit level for each product that's dispensed. So you're not going to need an additional layer of tracking, really. You should be able to track that all the way back to exactly where it came from, where it originated, just the way we do with food products in the United States. So even though it's a 10-year period, given the kind of slow emergence of biosimilars onto the marketplace, I think that there's really not the need for an additional layer of security that way. That helps.
Well, just kind of to follow up there. So say the FDA then mandates or doesn't mandate that INNs for biosimilars be unique. Go through and tell me the difference. What's going to happen? What will be the differences in competition and competitive pricing that would result? I mean, how would that decision affect that?
The decision to require unique names, you mean? Yes.
Yeah. How would that? I mean, we heard from the RAND study, for example, the cost studies, and there have been many other studies prior to that that have talked about these benefits, and just having more competitors in the market. There's sort of the level of competition that would result and drive down the prices and the savings to consumers. How does that play in terms? I mean, does the unique naming, does it matter in terms of the level of competition and the savings that would result?
It does, because it directly impacts the automatic substitution at the pharmacy. And so that's really the key point there, because you need to have the non-unique names in order to allow for the same level of substitution, the same pharmacy practice in place today that exists for small molecule generics. It's really the availability of the automatic substitution that allows for such a high degree of utilization with respect to the small molecule generics, or today's generics, that has translated into the savings that you mentioned, Steve, in your opening remarks, which is, it's been 1.46 trillion over the past decade, and 213 billion, I think, is the number last year. So it's a tremendous amount of savings. It's actually pretty much taken for granted, I think, to some degree now, that generics will produce these kinds of savings, and which is, I guess, a good problem to have. But without the naming being consistent with the current standard, that could all fall by the wayside.
I think I was, yeah, I just, to add two thoughts, I guess. One, in some other parts of the world, in Germany, for instance, branded generics are a reality, and you see generic manufacturers going out on small molecule generics, and they have to market their products because there are different names, and they have to go out and convince docs to prescribe their version of whatever generic drug it is rather than someone else's. And so that's if we did get into a situation with differentiated names, you'd see biosimilar manufacturers thinking about that kind of decision too.
I think just to add, I don't know if people are aware of this. Well, we're all aware of this. But the FTC has been looking at the competition issues as well. They had a public meeting in February of this year. We haven't gotten a report back yet, but I think it'll be very interesting to see what they have to say about it. That's all I can really tell you.
Okay, Lee, I just wanted to ask you one thing before I turn it over. Just a question. What do you think is needed to get consumers engaged in this issue?
I say this a lot every time I meet on this issue. I think a lot of education is needed, and I'm not sure where it's going to come from because explaining these products to your average consumer is really, really difficult. We struggled with it during health reform. We had a really hard time getting our members to engage. It seems like the only thing you can say is, those really expensive drugs, and everyone goes, oh, okay, those. And that's the only time you really get some recognition of what these products are in the first place. And then to move into explaining the substitution issues and the interchangeability issues and the biosimilar issues is really difficult. So I think coming up with an effective way to communicate to consumers what these products are and why they're so important is going to be huge.
Okay, well, I'd like to hear some questions. If anyone has any questions, feel free to stand up. Just let me know your name and affiliation. And do we have any questions from the audience at this point? I do want to say one thing, though, because from kind of one of the things I'm hearing is the naming issue to some extent. To me, some of this is simply just a barrier to entry that appears to be thrown up, just put out there to protect the originator's product. I can't understand why the FDA seems to be so slow in realizing that. Now, I just my perception seems to be that it's clear that if they move towards the pathway first and even considered at the same time to deal with the naming issue, but it just seems like they're putting. It's almost like the cart before the horse, and the result of that is to get products keep them out of the system, and that delay just it affects patient outcome and savings, and I don't want to opine, but just for the life of me, I don't understand. To me, it's just a clear barrier to entry, and those are the sorts of things I think that we need to do to kind of clear those barriers and get competition and get these products to consumers who need them. Let me ask another question here. Maybe Joanne, maybe you can get to this. I mean, so the pharmacists, what are their biggest concerns at this point? Are you supportive of the biologic entry into the market in general?
We're always supportive of anything that's going to lower costs for patients, that's safe. And the understanding right now is that these are going to be safe drugs and they will lower costs for patients. I think, as I said earlier, one of the biggest concerns we have is kind of the level of disinformation that's been promulgated thus far. There are a lot of scaremongering websites. It's always a fun, sexy story about how drugs are going to kill you. So it's a very easy thing to write about. It's very difficult, as Lee said, to explain. And so what's going to end up happening is clinicians are going to prescribe things. And I not to cast aspersions on physicians, they do know what they're doing with the drugs, but the pharmacists are the medication experts. So they're the ones who end up explaining, sometimes at the drugstore counter, exactly what the risks and benefits are of drugs and trying to explain to their customers and their patients, this is going to be the same as the other thing. And it's a very difficult thing to do, even with regular generics. So once you get into the more costly, very expensive things, well, they think, I don't want the knockoff version of the filgrastim. I want the real stuff. It's just like with a couture bag, anything like that. So I think just working back from that is going to be a real problem. And then we do have concerns about workflow integration and the mistakes that might arise from having unique names.
So were there any questions? We have any questions?
Living right with citizens against government waste. One thing I read recently, and I'm not saying I agree with it, is that it was a former FDA official who said that because the biosimilars may require extra testing, that the savings is not going to be there, and that we're sort of dreaming to see these huge savings. And I was just wondering if anybody wanted to address.
Yeah, I think there's, and you can address this too, but I think there's been a lot in the literature over the last decade of put the savings like on the generics themselves are probably 70-75%, and on the biosimilars, a lot of the studies are more in the 20 to 30% range. They're very complex, and sometimes the solutions are completely different manufacturing processes. Does anybody want to add anything?
I think the thinking is that those extra costs that would be involved in clinical trials, even if they are small, would be a barrier for some potential biosimilar manufacturers to not to be able to make that investment. And so, it would affect the number of entrants you'd expect to see in the market. It would affect the price savings that you'd expect to see at the end of the day. And so I think that's that idea that those extra costs are just an extra hurdle that potential competitors need to overcome before they'll make that investment.
And I think it's important to note it's going to be a complex market to some degree. There will be biosimilars, there will be interchangeable biosimilars, there will be sort of variations on a theme, and it's all good news for patients and for payers because while we may not see, it's unlikely that we'll see the 80% kind of price discounting that we see with small molecule generics. Obviously, the prices are so much higher, the drugs are so much costly that 15 to 20 to 30% decrease is still tremendously substantial. And as I think Lee pointed out in her presentation, these represent the vast majority of the pipeline. So I think that's all very important to keep in mind. That could be the FDA's mission, and this also relates to your earlier observation, is public safety, and with regard to the products in its jurisdiction. And so, we'll have to see what the regulations ultimately reveal. That is why they are, or that is their explanation for why they are considering over a lengthy period of time how to go about all of this. And I did want to point out that the FDA used to have on its website, right there in plain sight, a statement supporting non-unique names. That was always their position. It's only recently that they have taken that off their website to reconsider their position around naming. So.
And if I could just add also, we have been discussing the naming issue, and we've been discussing substitution, but those are really only two fights that are taking place in this debate. There are other aspects as well, and some of them are taking place at FDA where they're discussing whether clinical trials need to be mandated, or they're discussing whether having an approval for one indication can be extrapolated to other indications. And there are a lot of different ways and a lot of different barriers that could potentially be out there that obviously would have an impact on the savings.
Well, it sounds like your comment earlier about the state legislation. We don't have competition today with biologics. So to me, it sounds like there's other barriers to entry being set up, formidable ones that will affect entry then even once the pathway is clear.
One other uncertainty in all of the estimates on cost savings, and it's something that we discuss, but there's just not enough information to do anything right now, is all the questions of litigation and how this will play out in the courts. And this is where a lot of, on the small molecule generic front, there's been a lot. That's the part that's really been very dynamic and changing over the past 30 years. And I think, I come back to my earlier comment, I think I'd expect that same thing in biosimilars too, and we're not going to know how all of that's going to play out until we see a few of these play out. And so I think there's a lot of interest in watching these first few cases that are being litigated now, and seeing how the parties interpret some of the requirements that are laid out in ACA, and then seeing how court decisions affect the number of competitors that we'll see in the market.
it is interesting. If you take a look at the players in the marketplace, there's a lot of interesting partnerships forming. So there's some partnerships between innovator companies and more traditional generic companies forming around ways to both manufacture, but also, to some degree, ensure market penetration of these products. So it's a really exciting new sort of twist in the pharmaceutical and healthcare marketplace that has a lot of potential and opportunity for manufacturers and for patients and for jobs creation and other issues. So.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions. Anybody have a question? Just one last thing I just wanted to tease up before we start to wrap here. So what else can we do? I mean, is there, what will happen if the efforts to curtail biosimilar competition, if that continues? I mean, what is it that we can do?
Well, you can get your passport out and trek out over to White Oak, Maryland, on the 7th to be supportive of and let your viewpoint be known on the Sandoz filgrastim. Your comments don't necessarily have to be limited to that particular product, but just generally, I think it's important to continue the drumbeat. We've been beating the drums for several years, but and the network, the biosimilars network that I mentioned of engaged stakeholders has been tremendously helpful, and we've gotten some results in some areas. So I think it's just very important to educate yourselves and your constituents about what these products are, and particularly about their safety and efficacy profile, as well as the potential for savings. I think that when people see the numbers and the good work that Andrew and others have done to show that, to leave this kind of savings on the table, it would just, it's not even really fiscally feasible to do that anymore at this stage. So very important to be educated and to be advocates and to be a voice.
Well, it's, we've talked time and time again today about the savings and providing consumers with choice and options, and working towards better outcomes, patient outcomes, and I think there's also another aspect too of it we really haven't touched on, but just sort of the other economic benefits of encouraging investment. Entry brings the encouragement of investment, R&D, and the creation of jobs and increase in economic output that sort of derives from that competition. And that's another sort of aspect that we haven't touched on here, but as an economist, I just thought I'd lay it out there. Does anyone have anything else before we close up? Were there any other questions, or anyone want to make any statements before we close? So with that, I want to thank you all for coming. We'll be here for a few minutes if you have any questions and want to come up and talk to us. But thanks so much. I want to thank my panelists. I learned an awful lot today, so thank you for coming.